We now recognize the Honorable Janette Garin of the 1st District of Iloilo for her privileged speech.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, distinguished colleagues. Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, allow me to rise on a matter of personal and collective privilege in relation to my profession prior and during and while I have been a legislator. I grew up in a province, got schooled in the province, and fate, you may call it fate, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, that I was able to avail of scholarships prodding me to finish medical school. Let me start with a very controversial issue among male and female, and this is the Viagra and condoms. I hope nobody will take offense with what I will say, but the cultural riddle goes this way. Why is Viagra, with its generic term sildenafil, so desired? And condoms are so repulsive in many cultures. Condoms are in the World Health Organization's list of essential drugs, but Viagra is not. I am not saying that do not use Viagra. I am not saying let us not patronize it, but I am pointing at the reality that exists not only within our country, but other developing nations as well. In Japan, it took 6 months for drug regulatory authorities to approve Viagra, but it took them 35 years to approve the oral contraceptive pill. Meanwhile, in developing countries, of course, the Philippines was one of these, the mad rush for Viagra often started even before the drug could be approved by local authorities. In Bali, sometime in 1999, and this was the peak of introduction of Viagra in Asia, Viagra was being sold at 120,000 rupias, or about $12 each. And mind you, the promo was, it is supposed to be free of delivery. And that's in Bali. Next slide, please. After Viagra, many innovations came. We have Levitor, otherwise known as Vardenafil, and Cialis, or Sildenafil, each with their respective urban legends. Prominent to note, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, was that Cialis became known as the weekend pill. And why is this so? It became very famous because allegedly it has 36 hours effectiveness. I don't know, but my male colleagues would probably attest to this or not. Chinese clones have followed, many of which are sold in the Philippines. Again, let me reiterate, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, I have no objections to this, but I am just pointing out at a cultural situation wherein urban legends and sometimes half-truths affect medical perception. Next slide, please. I hope the Viagra did not get stuck. After Viagra, there came Cipla. Cipla is actually an Indian generic company, very famous, known for producing essential drugs, including antiretrovirals, which is very important because they pave way for the reduction of cost on treatment on HIV-infected and full-blown AIDS patients. But Cipla entered the market, and they now produce its own version of Cialis. They have Tadacip, which is a combination of Tadalafil and Cipla, its mother company. Next slide, please. But sad to note, and surprising to note, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleague, is the fact that condoms and pills are continued to be resisted and demonized, both blamed for promoting promiscuity and fueling HIV and AIDS. In fact, Bernardo Villegas once wrote about condoms, calling it that diabolical device. But I don't know, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleague, why all the attention on this, which are listed in the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, while in fact everybody pretends to have a blind eye and deafness when it comes to Viagra and other related innovations. Next slide, please. Let us now define the gender ideology behind Viagra. Why is this so? Allow me to quote a very renowned anthropologist, one of my professors when I took up my master's in business administration and when I specialized in healthcare, Dr. Michael Lim Tan. He's a regular columnist of the Inquirer, and he mentioned, in the Philippines, baog pardon me for the word, but baog means both impotent and infertile. We don't want to we don't want to agree with this, but we are referring to the cultural acceptance of how male and the masculinity that comes with it gets affected if somebody is perceived to be baog, otherwise known to be impotent or infertile. Many people, especially in the male sector, believes that that fate is worse than death because traditional thinking emphasizes the reproductive imperative that everyone must reproduce, and its links to male prowess and performance. Next slide, please. Relating sexuality to gender, dominant sexual ideology centers on the need to reproduce, but this in turn generates a gender ideology where men, I'm not saying all of our men, but generally the cultural perception is that men are seen as the main agents of procreation, while women are sometimes considered as mere receptacles or vessels for the product of males. Next slide, please. Males are somehow perceived to be the source of life and are privileged when it comes to pleasure, and women as source of pleasure or simply as a bearer of men's baby are not that privileged. This, I again repeat, is a quote I got from anthropologist Dr. Mike Tan. Now, condoms and Viagra, is this a comparison or not? Viagra and other medicines for erectile dysfunction join traditional aphrodisiacs, and they are glorified for enhancing male sexuality. And I do hope my male colleagues will take interest in the next statement that I'll make. Condoms and pills are framed mainly as contraceptives rather than as life-saving medicines. That is in the Philippine culture, which subvert dominant sexual ideologies. Condoms are targeted in particular because not only do they prevent reproduction, but allegedly they reduce pleasure. Again, another urban legend. But of course, my male colleagues will know better than this. Next slide, please. And between life and death, tragically, the obsession with male reproduction and pleasure leads to the rejection of life-saving roles of condoms and contraceptives. In fact, in the several patients that I had, there is always a refusal to submit oneself to bilateral tubal ligation, even if it is needed, because of the urban legend that it decreases the secretion of women. Shrill voices have been heard against condoms and contraceptives, while there is a silence about Viagra. Next slide, please. And what is the whole truth? And pardon me for this term, but allow me to reiterate that a half-truth is a whole lie. Why am I saying this? Bakit ko po ito sinasabi? Bilang isang doktor, nasasaktan po kami sa mga paratang ng iba. I understand the fear and the concern of other people. I understand the fear and the concern of contraindications and side effects, but allow me to appeal, not only to our distinguished colleagues, but to other people as well, that when we say something, especially if it is related to medical and paramedical profession, let us give the whole truth, because half-truth is a whole lie. Let me start with a very much abused statement that the World Health Organization, specifically the International Agency for Research on Cancer, concluded that certain contraceptives are carcinogenic to humans. Again, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, I am trying to explain this because having been in practice for several years, a misconception that doctors who prescribe contraceptives are becoming criminals. Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, that will be the biggest insult in my whole lifetime. Yes, indeed, WHO IARC made that statement. But allow me to appeal to our distinguished colleagues and to the general public that we continue with the statement and we interpret it in the way that it should be interpreted. This statement is concluded as contained in monographs. And what are monographs? It is an exercise in evaluating cancer hazards. Yan po totoo. Nagkaroon ng conclusion na ganyan and it is contained in a monograph. That is why it is specifically contained in a monograph, because the risk is very little. And that is why it was placed there as a distinction between hazard and risk. And the distinction between hazard and risk is very important because the purpose of this monograph is that new uses, ibig sabihin, yung bagong innovation ng mga gamot na ito o yung bagong innovation ng combined oral contraceptives will have unforeseen exposures that could engender risks that are significantly higher. Meaning to say, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, is that is a baseline that is established, but risk, and a medical parlance never and is never transmitted to incidents. Malaki po ang pagkakaiba ng risk, malaki pang pagkakaiba ng hazard, at masyadong malaki ang pagkakaiba sa tinatawag nating incidents, or what we call the number of cases. The risk-benefit profile is being left to international or national agencies. In our case, FDA, previously known as BFAD. On the international aspect, we have the World Health Organization. That is basically the reason why, even if IARC had this conclusion, they went further to determine the risk and the benefit. And WHO included oral contraceptive pills in the model list of essential drugs. Next slide, please. The UNDP and the World Bank Special Program of Research Development and Research Training likewise said the use of COCs modifies slightly the risk of cancer. Again, it says the risk of cancer, increasing it in some sites and decreasing it in others. That is the half-truth. But the whole truth is, if you go further and read, this study and this conclusion is based on the data that refers to the older, higher doses of combined oral contraceptives that we are not using now. Yan po ang sinasabi ko, ang half-truth ay dapat pong gawin whole truth. Next slide, please. And this paved way, dahil nga nagkaroon ng ganitong mga findings, WHO committees work on several studies creating evidence-based family planning guidelines. Ibig sabihin, may ebidensya at may pinagbabasihan at hindi po haka-haka, and keeping them up to date on a continuous basis. Up to this point of time, Madam Speaker, distinguished colleagues, it is an evolving science, and every now and then it is being checked, and all the medical practitioners are continuously updated. They regularly review the safety of COCs and assess the balance of risks and benefits of contraceptive use, and have determined that for most healthy women, the health benefits clearly exceed the health risks. Next slide, please. And how do oral contraceptives affect breast cancer? Ang ipinakita po ay nagkaroon ng correlation, nagkaroon ng pagdudugtong or connection. But this is because of a hormone we call the estrogen. But the estrogen that is being referred to is the endogenous estrogen. And if we say endogenous or natural estrogen, that natural hormone is being produced by our body. But when it came to experimentations about commercial preparations that has been tapered, scientific studies that has been combined time and again, with around 54,000 sample patients and around 100,000 controlled patients, encompassing 200 compiled studies and analysis for the past 35 years, showed that this does not happen in commercially prepared hormones. Natural hormones are present in menarche. Ibig po sabihin, maagang nagregla. The menstruation onset before 12 years old, or menopausal after 55 years old, first child after 30 years old, and those without children. These four situations point to a situation wherein mas matagal ang exposure ng isang babae sa kanyang natural hormones dahil hindi nagbabago ang kanyang composition dahil nga meron siyang menstruation or matagal siyang magmenopause. Next slide, please. And these are the contraindications. There are absolute contraindications and there are relative contraindications. What do we